So we looked at budget execution. Now we want to take a brief look at realignment. And as we've discussed and as you know, realignment is the shifting of program responsibilities across levels of government. So the two forms of realignment that we're most familiar with are what we label as 1991 realignment, which was the realignment of social services, mental health, and public health programs in 1991 using sales tax as the revenue source for paying the counties to operate programs that had traditionally been done at the state level. And then we have the more recent realignment that's been imposed on the counties, and which is much more than just the parolees under AB 109. There's a significant shift of a number of programs to the county level. And those are actually broken into two phases, which we call Phase 1 and Phase 2. So Phase 1 is the one we're currently in right now. Phase 2 is proposed and very little discussion has been had yet at this point. So the goal of realignment, as stated by the governor of the state of California, is that it is to find the level of government where a service can best and most cost effectively be delivered and then provide a permanent funding source. So realignment, as we know it, is realigning certain programs from the state of California to the county because, as we've discussed before, local government is in the best position to provide direct services, and higher levels of government aren't so well suited for that. Other reasons as to why realignment is important is because it also reduces duplication. So, for example, think about Cal OSHA. There's also a federal OSHA. So there's two offices that enforce labor protections for employees, or the Environmental Protection Agency. There's both a state one and there is a federal one as well. So what causes various levels of government to deliver the same service, or what causes higher levels of government that typically are not service delivery entities to get involved with service delivery? So we need to go back and we need to look at the history of how services began to congregate at higher levels of government. And the most classic one is the 1971 Serrano decision. And this was a decision that ultimately would drive such things as special education districts like SELPAs and that type of thing, because there was a court determination that education is a constitutional right and that everyone should have access to education. So in order to assure that occurred, you actually saw the emergence of departments of education at both the state and the federal level. As a result, when prior to that, most of the education services had been concentrated at the local level through such things as school districts. Then in 1978, we had the infamous Proposition 13. And Proposition 13 set forth certain restrictions on property tax as far as how property tax can be raised and increased, because at the time in 1978, property tax was the primary funding resource for government. So Proposition 13 causes a significant blow to local government due to restrictions on the ability to increase property tax. So property tax as a primary funding source begins to diminish. It still today remains a large portion of local government revenue, but other things like sales tax and then special taxes on things like utilities and communications and businesses and that type of thing make up the difference. So when Prop 13 went into effect, local governments were essentially, for all intents and purposes, devastated. And so the state of California stepped in and began to backfill using state general fund, backfilled lost property tax revenues at the local level. So as a result of that one single phenomenon, state government became more directly involved in funding service delivery at the local level, therefore tying local government more closely to state government, and therefore making local government more susceptible to the whims of what happens at the state level relative to funding and appropriation of funding. And then in 1991, why we saw the very first realignment that we labeled 1991 realignment was because in the late 80s and early 90s there was an economic downturn. And so Pete Wilson was governor at the time, and he decided to shift certain entitlements from the state level to the local level because the state was limited in being able to control costs on those fronts, since they actually couldn't set cost limits on those services. So that was the initial realignment. So let's look at what makes up realignment in 2011. So phase one is entitled the public safety component, and you can see all of the programs here that are actually realigned under 2011 realignment. That includes fire, court security, VLF safety, vehicle license fee safety, those safety programs that are funded with VLF. And then the next three are directly related to AB 109. So here it's labeled as low-level offenders. Those are what we know as the non-nons, non-sexual, non-violent, non-serious. Transfer the parole function to the probation department, the other piece of AB 109. And then a piece we really haven't talked about too much, but as juvenile justice, and actually almost a wholesale reduction in state involvement with incarceration of youth. The California Youth Authority is practically ceasing to exist. Then also included in realignment, community mental health programs, which in fiscal year 2011-12 was funded by a redirection of Mental Health Services Act funding at the state level, a violation of the act, but not fought because what would be the alternative, which could have been worse consequences, actually direct cuts in programs. And this was a diversion of Mental Health Services Act at the state level that was just sitting there. It was sitting there for state activities. It had not been allocated to the county. So that was actually the money that was diverted, about $89 million. And then substance abuse was realigned, and foster care and child welfare services and adult protective services. So part of what we're also saying here is that mental health, substance abuse, foster care, child welfare services, and adult protective services are now considered, in the eyes of the state of California, to be programs related to public safety. And that is why they were included in phase one. So phase two, which we really haven't even begun to discuss yet, would be that health services, so Medi-Cal and indigent health, would actually go to the state. There would actually be no provision of those services at the local level. And obviously the reason for that is because with the advent of healthcare reform and the full expansion of Medicaid in 2014 to 100% of eligible folks, that's a significant amount of, 100% reimbursement to eligible folks. That's a significant source of revenue because it doesn't require match. And so the state of California wants to be able to be responsible for the provision of those services come 2014, so they'd be eligible for 100% of the federal funding. Phase two also includes a shift of in-home supportive services from the local level to the state. That actually in the proposed budget on January 5th actually speaks to creating a year-long stakeholder process in fiscal year 12-13 to talk about what that would look like. And actually what would really most likely happen is the emerging discussion at this particular point is IHSS actually becomes a managed care function that would be managed under a private insurance company, with most likely the private insurance company directly contracting with counties to provide assessment and oversight of the providers and the clients. CCS is California Children's Services. This is services for children who have suffered a catastrophic illness and for income reasons are unable to pay their medical bills. This program does that. CalWORKs in its entirety then would go to the counties, which, as well as food stamps, which that unto itself proposes a really unique set of circumstances, because both CalWORKs and food stamps are federal mandates on the state, but the state turns them over 100% to the counties. So obviously the state would still have some authority there, because the federal government is only going to want to deal with 50 states and not all of the counties within each of the states. So CalWORKs and food stamps realignment to the counties provides a significant challenge. So again, everything in phase 2 that you see here before you is hardly ever been discussed yet, because we're still talking about all those phase 1 activities. A lot of issues in phase 1, and we'll look a little bit closer at those in a second. So what funds realignment? So 2011 realignment is proposed to be funded by a combination of sales tax and vehicle license fee. So sales tax is actually an increase of the current tax rate by 1.5%, which, when realignment in 2011 was originally proposed, that additional sales tax revenue was already in place, but it was set to expire, and that's what the legislature was unable to come to an agreement on with the governor, and was actually, the legislature was unwilling to put that particular issue before the voters for a vote. So that's why you see the governor doing his own initiative on the November ballot, asking the voters of California if they want to restore or extend, I'm not sure what the right words will be used yet, for these particular revenue sources that would fund the realignment programs that have been transferred to the counties. By the way, when you add 5.1 to 500 million vehicle license fee, is just a tax that's charged on your registration for your vehicle. That's 5.6 billion. We're really talking about a transference of programs that are really worth in cost more like 9 billion. So right off the bat, even with the uncertainty of these two revenue sources, because they're now at the purview of a decision of the voters in November, after the next fiscal year starts, by the way, you still have the problem that even if this was passed, it doesn't provide the level of revenue that would be needed to run the programs. But nonetheless, the budget does propose that all these programs be run for $6.7 billion, which means then that part of what would need to happen is that you could see here at the bottom of the table that they're expecting the sales tax to produce additional revenue over time, an increase at time. Actually, both revenue sources to increase in time, taking us to about $6.7 billion in 2014-15 fiscal year. But here are all the programs that I mentioned earlier, and here's how those funds are allocated out. So, and these are in the millions. So, we're talking billions of dollars. So if you look under mental health, for example, existing mental health programs this year, $1.1 billion. Growing about $60 million over a four fiscal year period. And then what is interesting is if you look under mental health, first of all, EPSDT is not proposed for any growth, and that unto itself is a interesting issue, because EPSDT grows every year, which, it's a form of managed care, because the state is capitating to a certain extent how they expect these resources to be allocated across all these programs. What will make the difference is if realignment revenue, whether it's VLF or the sales tax, comes in at a higher rate and actually generates more revenue than what has been estimated, then that would benefit the county. So you can see there under EPSDT, early and periodic screening, diagnosis, and treatment, the line item for mental health managed care, which is a primary funding source for things like crisis and med management at the county level, cut by 50% each of the last 3 years. So hardly any revenue there in 2011-12, and then that's actually slated to jump up to a couple $100 million in future years. And then again, all of these really just set at static numbers, but this gives you an idea of what they're thinking as far as the contextual framework for the financing for what's realigned to the counties. Now, realignment, when it comes to the county as a sales tax and VLF revenue, it falls into a series of accounts. And so what this table here represents, this figure, this schematic in front of you, represents is the accounts that would be made up of the 2011 realignment. But you can see there on the top off to the side that there's still 1991 realignment. That's still in place. That revenue source is still there. The expectations for providing services with that revenue are still there. But then you've got the addition of the 2011 realignment. And so locally there's this county local reserve fund, and that's actually broken into two separate major accounts at the local level. Here it says support services accounts. That's more commonly today referred to as the health and human service account. And then the law enforcement account. So these are all of the programs related to realignment of the incarceration piece, like the AB 109 and that type of thing. And so, okay, so you have these two counts, one labeled supportive services, one labeled law enforcement. One of the key discussions that's going on there right now is what flexibility will be afforded to the Board of Supervisors. This is, part of the major shift in provision of programs, because now the Board of Supervisors have authority over programs that are entitlements and mandates from higher levels of government. And while this part of the discussion is not yet complete and final decisions have yet to be made, a lot of discussion around what's the transferability between the Health and Human Service account and the law enforcement account. I mean, really, so think about that. We're juxtaposing social services against law enforcement, and at the Board of Supervisor level, which one do you think is going to win? So this is up for discussion. What transferability should there be? And then you look at the left there, and you go down the Health and Human Services account. You can see there's a protective services and behavioral health account. All right, so basically those programs that are traditionally found in social services get their own sub-account, and really, honestly, under each of these are other sub-accounts. So, I mean, we end up with like 14 different accounts under Health and Human Services. But then you've got the sub-account where the mental health and the behavioral health type of activities reside. All right, so creating some level of firewalls between these accounts, so one chunk of money isn't necessarily being spent on the other. But then again, to allow for some flexibility, what level of transfer occurs between these two accounts? And you can see on this particular one, the proposal at the time that this table was created, that the ability to transfer up to 10% of the lesser sub-account between these sub-accounts. And that's still up for decisions right now. So in a visual way, this represents 2011 realignment. These are the way the money flows and how the money is accounted for at the local level. So there's a lot of issues around Phase 1. So when we talk about Phase 1 not being done, these are the things that have yet to be decided. There's no finality on any of these. So therefore, Phase 1 is far from being completed because of these issues. So the first one, obviously, we're very familiar with is the revenue source. The fact that the 1.5% sales tax has already sunsetted. That was reduced effective the last day of the last fiscal year. So on July 1, that was a lower amount, and now we need to ask the voters in November if they're willing to put that back in place. And then this whole idea of constitutional protection. And what that means is that in exchange for receiving these programs at the county level, that there's a guarantee that the state government will work to make sure that there's adequate funding for those programs. So let's say the November initiative that the governor's put on the ballot doesn't pass. The fact that there currently is not a constitutional protection in place, what happens after that? All those programs have still been realigned to the counties, but now there's no longer a revenue source, put in place to fund that. So does it come out of state general fund? Well, then that kind of shot the whole process in the foot to begin with, because the state general fund was trying to shed all these programs by realigning them to begin with. Base. What is base? What base mean is, what's the base level at which we begin this funding? So the point at which we will measure moving forward. What is the base amount? Since there is no guaranteed revenue source at this time, the amount of money going into these accounts, and there is money going into these accounts, and it is sales tax and it is VLF revenue, but at a lower rate. I mean, in some of these programs, you're only experiencing about 20% of the revenue that you should be experiencing. In other words, 80% less than what's necessary to actually do the program. But the state promised in this initial year of realignment, without these funding sources in place, that the state would provide the funding for that. And most of the programs are getting pretty close, but in almost every instance, there's still less money than what was actually predicted to be there. So what's the level at which we start? And when I say that, measuring forward, which takes us into the next part, which is growth. So over time, there's going to be growth over the base. In other words, from year to year, these revenue sources will produce more revenue. But what's the actual growth amount? So the one amount from 1 year to the next year, and then what's the difference between that amount and what the additional revenue is? Then that's called the growth, because there was growth in the revenue. Then how's that allocated out? Is it allocated out according to growth in the programs? So in 1991 realignment, for example, social services did really well. So social services program, primarily programs with cases under public assistance, received the growth cut first. And in some years, that growth was so significant, there was no growth dollars left for the other programs in mental health and public health. So how do we handle growth in 2011 realignment? How's that growth allocated amongst all of those programs that we saw in the previous table? And, there's just no easy way to do that. And so that's still under discussion. Now, as I mentioned earlier, transferability. So the ability, providing boards of supervisor flexibility at the local level to be able to transfer money between the various accounts to where it's most needed. But how do you create protections or firewalls to make sure they don't get carried away and move too much of the health and human services money into law enforcement, or vice versa? And how do you juggle those competing interests at the local level? And one of the ways you do that is you establish rules around that transferability that are established at the state level, and therefore carry a statutory authority. And so this is a huge issue. We spent a whole year on this last year and did not come to a conclusion. And then something that's hardly even gotten to the discussion at all is, what do you do around reserves? I mean, is there a reserve at the state level where part of that growth goes into the reserve? So when there's an economic downturn and there's less sales tax revenue, then you draw from the reserve in order to soften the impact and make cash revenue income kind of equal throughout and over time, regardless of the economic situation. I would argue, as a local director who's worked with realignment since 1991, that when we get additional revenue at the local level, we put it into reserve for that exact reason. So, I would argue that's already happening. And if we create that at the state level, it just creates one more instance of where we need to figure out an allocation methodology for how we pull that money out of the reserves, allocate it to the various counties. And it's just, it's just one more level of discussion that needs to occur. So personally, I would argue that be handled on a county by county basis at the county prerogative, and that there really be no state authority, or more importantly, no statewide account. And the other thing that really worries me about having a statewide account is that money sits there and the legislature has a tendency to eyeball it and then come and take it and use it for something it wasn't legally meant to be used for. Common strategy from our buddies in Sacramento. Here's a diagram that just helps to illustrate how revenue sources fluctuate and the impact that has on local counties. So what you have here is a diagram that came out of the Los Angeles Times around looking at revenue in Shasta County for mental health, and it shows a number of years, and then budget policy requiring that the county devote more money to Medi-Cal. In other words, the match requirement for receiving state and federal revenue at the local level, there's always some kind of local match. And part of that is because the higher levels of government cannot fund the entire activity, but more importantly, that match helps control the costs, because the more costs there are, the more the local government has to contribute. So in order to keep those costs down and contribute less, that's a mechanism by which higher levels of government induce local government to have some level of cost control. But what happens then is that match typically comes from realignment, because it's technically a discretionary source of funding, because there's some flexibility in its use. So counties are be darned if they're actually going to use their general fund, the money that they spend on police and fire, to be spent on mental health. Mental health just doesn't, unfortunately, rise to the level in most boards of supervisors to be considered a priority over public safety. It just isn't going to happen, even though the new realignment kind of makes this case that mental health is part of public safety. So then that means the discretionary money at the local level, or the realignment, begins to shrink. But then realignment has primary responsibility for programs that it must pay, which in our case is indigent health. That realignment's really there to be able to provide services to indigent folks that don't qualify for any other programs like Medi-Cal. And so realignment's one of the funding sources we use at the local level to do that. But if we're using more of that to pay the match for those programs where other people are eligible, where indigents aren't eligible, then we're using indigent health money to pay for folks that are qualifying for Medi-Cal. And that further limits the money that we have available for the indigent in our community. It limits our ability to meet our statutory mandate to provide those services locally to the indigent population. And then that just means less people are served. So that's what you kind of have here before you. And it's a little snippet of how counties use realignment for both match and for locally mandated programs such as indigent health, and how those two things really interact with one another and affect our ability to use realignment as it was intended because of things that the state of California has done to us. So in summary, in all these different parts of Weekly Unit 5 and 6, we've looked at examples of bureaucracy. We went back to Rodenhauser Chapter 4 and all these oversight and review mechanisms that affect the model that we've been building over the last few classes that we've used for demonstrating the model, the systems model of mental health administration and oversight and authority. And then we also took a close look at budgets and what makes up budgets, and reinforced that budgets themselves are a policy implementation tool. And then we took a closer look at realignment and the fact that because of a budget downturn, that bureaucracy was transferred wholesale from state to local counties, and all the issues around how that has occurred.